Hey guys, so the R6 and the RP, two cameras that are kind of similar but also very different. We have on the one hand the RP, which is a budget-friendly full-frame mirrorless camera under $1,000, and then we have the R6, which has a lot of feature upgrades. It's a much newer full-frame mirrorless camera, and it's also 2.5 times the price of the RP. So we're gonna look at today, when is that extra price justified? When does it make sense to actually go for the RP, and when might that be a better choice, and which one might be right for you? So just a quick overview of the specs on these cameras. First of all, we have the RP, which is a 26.2 megapixel full frame camera, and the R6, which is a 20.1 megapixel full frame camera. On the RP, we have Canon's dual pixel autofocus, which is really good, and especially the latest version of this works really well and includes eye tracking autofocus in photo and video. But then on the R6, we have dual pixel autofocus version 2. And again, the dual pixel autofocus was good, but the version 2, no comparison, is way better, faster, more reliable. And it also covers 100% of the sensor, which means you can focus anywhere on your image. And it adds animal eye tracking autofocus to the other features that the RP already had. In photography, with the RP, realistically, we can shoot about 3 frames per second or maybe less. With the R6, completely different story. We can shoot 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter and 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter. And we also have with the R6 a maximum shutter speed of 1/8,000th of a second, and on the RP we only get half of that at 1/4,000th of a second. In video with the RP we can shoot up to 4K at 24 frames per second, but in 4K the RP has a 1.7 times crop on the sensor and it loses dual pixel autofocus. We can shoot 1080 up to 60 frames per second on the RP. We also have 24 frames per second in 1080 on the RP, and with that we can shoot in full frame and we have full dual pixel autofocus performance. On the R6, we can shoot in full frame 4K up to 60 frames per second with full dual pixel autofocus performance, and we also keep autofocus performance in 120 frames per second at 1080 on the R6. They both have built-in Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. The RP comes with one UHS 2 SD card slot. The R6 has 2 UHS 2 SD card slots, and the R6 also has amazing in-body image stabilization that works in both photo and video. So when it comes to build quality and ergonomics, the body of the R6 is really similar to most of the bodies of the Canon R series, and for me, I think it's definitely one of, if not the most comfortable cameras to use. It's big and beefy for a mirrorless camera, and it's really comfortable to shoot, even if you're using bigger lenses to shoot for a long time with. The RP, on the other hand, is noticeably smaller. I will say for the size, it is surprisingly comfy. I think it's more comfy and easier to use, or more comfortable to use, than like the Sony cameras that are sometimes even a little bit bigger than that. If it is too small for you, they do have a grip extension that you can buy, but Canon doesn't make a battery grip extension for the RP. When it comes to controls on these cameras, the RP has 2 dials and no joystick, whereas the R6 actually has 3 dials and the joystick. So for controls, the R6 is a definite winner. Both of these cameras have a traditional mode dial on top. When it comes to the viewfinders, the R6 has a 0.5 inch 3.69 million dot EVF, and it's really great. The RP has a 0.39 inch 2.36 million dot EVF, and I'll say the RP's EVF isn't bad. It's actually a better EVF than some of the full frame mirrorless cameras that cost even more than the RP, but the R6 EVF is noticeably better when you compare the two. Both of these cameras have a 3-inch vari-angle flip-out touchscreen. On the R6, it's 1.32 million dots, and on the RP, it's 1.06 million dots. And while that doesn't sound like a big difference, and I do think the screen on the RP is very usable in use, I do think you can tell a difference between these two screens. The shutter on the RP, you can only use an electronic first curtain shutter, and you can use fully silent, fully electronic shutter, but only in a complete auto mode. And on the R6, you can choose from using completely mechanical to completely electronic shutter, You have much more control there. When it comes to batteries, the R6 has Canon's newest LPE6NH battery, and the RP has the LPE17 battery that a lot of the Canon Rebel series cameras use. Battery life is going to be noticeably less in the RP, and you're definitely going to have backups to get through some shoots and days of shooting with the RP. When it comes to ports, they both have pretty much the same ports: headphone, mic, you have remote shutter, USB-C that they can both use for USB-C charging, and then the RP has a mini HDMI, whereas the R6 has a micro HDMI. And then of course they both use Canon's RF mount, which is really nice and really versatile. You can adapt almost any lens onto this system. So when it comes to photography, on paper, the RP looks like it's going to be better with a 26 megapixel versus a 20 megapixel sensor, but in reality, that is definitely not the case. The image quality from the R6 is hands down better, and that's when it comes to colors, dynamic range for sure. The image quality on the RP is not bad, especially when you're looking at the price point. But for the R6, it's a huge step up, and it's also a huge step up in performance in photography on the R6. For instance, the dual pixel autofocus version 2 of the R6, if you have people in your frame, it is just not going to miss. And again, the dual pixel autofocus was good, but the version 2 is just way better. And especially if you're trying to shoot action, fast shooting with the RP, it just doesn't exist. Whereas the R6 is really one of the best options out there, especially at this price point. And the R6 also adds animal eye tracking autofocus. And honestly, the difference between 20 megapixels and 26 megapixels is pretty negligible in most cases anyway, as far as resolution goes. And if you're not shooting action, you're not shooting things in high dynamic range situations, the RP is not a bad option at all, especially again for the price point. But the R6 is definitely a better camera. So the R6 is definitely a better photo camera than the RP, but when it comes to video, it blows the RP away even more. And I will say, the RP is a good 1080 camera, especially for someone like a content creator who needs a quick turnaround workflow. In 1080, we can shoot up to 60 frames, so we can even get some slow motion with that. But the RP in 4K becomes pretty problematic. We have the 1.7 times crop, we lose dual pixel autofocus, and the contrast autofocus that the RP has in 4K is really just not good. And then the rolling shutter performance is pretty terrible in the RP. If you're hand holding the camera, the footage is basically going to be unusable. If it's on a tripod and you don't have to use autofocus, you can get away with some certain shots, but in general, the 4K is not going to be a feature that you're going to use on the RP. The R6, on the other hand, is an awesome 4K camera, and we can shoot 4K on the R6 up to 60 frames per second in full frame with dual pixel autofocus version 2. And we also keep that autofocus performance in 120 frames per second in 1080, which the RP also doesn't have. Now I do want to address the issue of overheating on the R6 because it is there, but honestly, for most shooters, it's completely overblown, and it only affects, first of all, modes that the RP doesn't have, and is really only going to affect 4K long form content. And that means when you're shooting 4K content for an hour or more. I did a more in-depth look at this in my review of the R6, which I'll link here. But for this comparison, the overheating only happens in modes that the RP doesn't even have, so it's not even a relevant factor here. The R6 can also shoot 10-bit 422 colors in C-Log, and the RP doesn't have any log format shooting and also only shoots 8-bit. And then, of course, we have the IBIS, the in-body image stabilization of the R6, and the IBIS is really awesome on the R6. It works great. If you're shooting super ultra wide, like 20 millimeters and beyond, you can get some wobble and jello effects from that. So I wouldn't suggest using this with ultra wide lenses, but outside of that, the performance of the IBIS and the R6 is really great. So which one might be right for you? And I'll say, I think it's pretty obvious the R6 is definitely a better camera in photography and video. We get better image quality, better performance, and if you are a professional making income already from photography or videography or as a hybrid shooter, the R6 is just going to be a better camera. But again, it's 2.5 times the price of the RP. And some people may not need necessarily all of the upgrades that the R6 comes with. And I'll say, if you are a photographer starting out as a professional, I think it would benefit you more to go for the RP and spend the rest of that budget on better lenses. Of course, that is assuming that you're not like a sports, action, wildlife photographer. And I do think that the RP is going to be something that might hold back professional video shooters. But if you want a small, compact camera setup, the RP is a great option with great performance for that size and great performance for the price point that it comes in at. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you're interested in either of these cameras or any of the gear that I've mentioned, in the description below, I'll leave affiliate links. If you purchase through those links at no extra cost to you, you'll help support this channel so that I can keep making videos for you guys. Let me know in the comments below. Are you looking at either of these cameras? What are you thinking about using them for? Which one might you be leaning towards? If you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button. See ya.